Okay, good afternoon everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. Today we have we're holding the ninth and final faculty presentation for this academic year. I hope you enjoyed the series. Today we have Dr. Kim Sturgis, who earned his PhD in English and American Studies from the University of East Anglia, Norwich in 2003. His research interests are Shakespeare, 19th century English literature, English studies and American ethnogenesis. He has published a couple of books, first one in 2004, Shakespeare and the American Nation, by Cambridge University Press. And last year, in June 2011, he published his second book, as I believe, This Precious Isle. He also he's published a number of journal articles and reviewed a number of books, of which I mentioned Shakespeare and American Life. Today he will be talking to us about the results of his research on the book entitled Deadwood Dick's Doom, or Calamity Jane's Last Adventure, A Tale of Death Notch. Did I pronounce it right? You did very well. So I'll leave you with Dr. Kim. You all help me welcome him.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you very much. All right. Well, so the idea, I think, is that I'm closing down a year's work from the various members of our faculty here. So we've had a number of presentations, and I've decided to, present my research, but also talk a little bit about the process of research, with the idea that as you leave Qatar and go off to wherever you go, you'll have some idea maybe to look at research in perhaps a slightly different way. Anyway, so that's what we're going to try and do. So let us begin. The research I'm presenting today was partly funded from a grant from the college here. Thank you to College of Arts and Sciences. And also, as you know, those of you who are involved with literature, the reality is for research we need primary texts. We have to go where the texts are. Secondary texts are really only secondary. So I will thank Cornell University, New York, Enoch Pratt, Baltimore, and the British Library in London, all of which allowed me access to their collections. Deadwood Dick's Doom, or Calamity Jane's Last Adventure, A Tale of Death Notch. Wonderful title. Comprehensive, I would suggest to you. This is a title that was designed by both the author and the marketeers, the publishing house, to appeal to the fans of Deadwood Dick, whoever he was, and also the fans of Calamity Jane. And it gives a suggestion of what the story may entail, because it adds in the last adventure, and it tells you that it's something about death, and there is a horrible valley somewhere. You've got the whole lot. This is sort of Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, would I suggest, in modern terms. But this is a lot earlier. And I came across this particular tale. Sorry, I'll go back a second. That's the title of the presentation. However, I've given it a subtitle. Don't judge a book by its cover. It's an old adage, and I'm going to suggest to you today it may be proven to be true. Or we can also call it Joy in Literature Research, because what we have here is a narrative. I'm going to give you a narrative of how, as a researcher, I followed the information. So, as an Englishman and a Shakespearean, I wasn't familiar with American dime novels. And I was actually doing some research on Shakespeare. This is a number of years ago. I was doing some study on Shakespeare, and I came across a character described in one of the books as William Henry Shakespeare, the poet of the West, and a philosophical protection of women's rights. We won't get into the grammar of this particular sentence. However, I was intrigued by this idea, and I read a bit further, and just to give you an example of why he perhaps was nicknamed William Henry Shakespeare, a maiden fair with voice like a dreamer, she sings and she plays like a regular screamer. Hardly the Bard of Avon, but nevertheless, quite fun. And I followed this bit of information, and I found that this introduced me to Deadwood Dick, and it also introduced me to something called the Beadle and Adams publishing house and their series of dime novels. So this was my first introduction. I was actually researching Shakespeare, but I diverted. And I then have to find out something about these dime novels. I don't know how much you know, but I can tell you, dime novel is perhaps we'd better describe as pulp fiction. It's 10 cents a book. So it's the sort of book that you read in one session. It's the sort of book that you don't need to spend too many days contemplating, right? And they're largely adventure stories with action. 127 pages always, apparently. Not 126, not 128, 127. Now, I'm going to suggest to you these dime novels are important to us understanding American literature because they are the precursor to American comics. All these funny things with Iron Man and Superman and every other man that comes out of these things can trace their roots back to the dime novels. I'm also going to suggest to you they are the precursor to Hollywood, cowboy and Indian movies. I know most of you are probably too young to have been fed on this sort of fodder, but I'm old enough to have been brought up as a child watching hours and hours and hours of John Wayne and Richard Widmark and various other people. Anyway, these all relate to dime novels. I didn't know this, but I found out. So when was the first dime novel published? 1860, would you believe? So, close on 155 years ago. And the very first dime novel is Malaeska, the Indian wife of the White Hunter, by Mrs. Anne Stevens. And it sold 65,000 copies. This was a publishing sensation. This was the very first dime novel, and for reasons which will become clear later on, the American public rolled into this idea and they bought them in mass quantities. So, there we go. This is the first cover of the first book, Beadle's dime novel. This is not, as you can see, it's hardly an upmarket affair. It's cheap paper, orange, lots of 19th century type words. Just what was this dime novel about? I'm going to tell you. But more importantly, how did Mrs. Stevens, and this is women's literature, how did Mrs. Stevens start this huge publishing sensation? And this is my moments of delicious confusion. Thanks. Melissa, those of you who were here a few weeks ago, a month ago, will know that Melissa, this is her phrase for what I think I experienced there. I have an slightly alternative, and that is my Sherlock Holmes moments. Right? So I find something I don't understand. I don't know. And as a researcher, I'm puzzled by it and I'm fascinated. And this is where I think we can talk just briefly about research. And I'm going to suggest to you, if there is joy in research, and I believe there is, it's trying to discover something you don't know. That may sound reasonably simple, but the reality is very large amounts of research time, years in fact, are spent by academics trying to prove something they already know. They already know it, but they're going to prove it to justify what they've said before. Or, even more negatively, they spend years and years trying to disprove something that someone else has said. I would suggest there's not a lot of joy in that. That's just hard work. I would suggest the research is better if we use it as an inspiration to search for answers. This is healthier and more fun. And this is certainly what I did. I would also suggest that some research is done with a preconceived thesis in mind. So you're forcing the information to fit. And I would suggest, as Sherlock Holmes, you don't do that. What you do is you look for the evidence, deduce where the evidence may be leading to, and then come up with an answer, and it's almost a surprise at the end. Yeah. And in this particular case, this is definitely what I was doing. Alright, so let's go back to our dime novel. The first dime novel. You can see it is mutated slightly. After the first few thousand copies, they felt they had a bit more money, so they paid for an engraver, and the engraver came up with this image, and we're going to talk about it. Has anybody read this? This is an open question to you. No. Okay. That doesn't surprise me. But let's look at this cover. What do you think the story is about? And I'll have some suggestions, please. What do you think this story might be about? What is the title? Malaeska, the wife of the Indian of the white hunter. All right. Anyway, there is this issue of a white hunter. Maybe if you were able to see it better, I can see it on my screen. You would see a man in buckskin. He is the so-called white hunter. We're not going to talk about white because that would take us about another hour of discussion of academic discourse. The person who's cradling him is an Indian. We're also not going to talk about that because that would take 2 hours. And we're not going to talk about cowboys. The Wild West, what I'm saying is, in the image, these people, when they were attracted to this book, without having masses of multimedia selling to them, they looked at this book cover, and I think they probably thought this was about cowboys and Indians, the Wild West, trappers, hunters, something like that. Yeah? Well, this is where we definitely do not judge a book by its cover. Setting, let me tell you. This book starts in the Catskill Mountains and Manhattan, somewhere around about the year 1700. The internal evidence from the book isn't clear. Catskills, if you are aware of Washington Irving's Rip Van Winkle, this book actually starts off in a very similar style to Rip Van Winkle. And I'm going to suggest to you the basic plot is a romance. And to me, a romance has a boy meeting a girl. Or vice versa. And in this story they do. A boy meets a girl, they love, and a baby son is the result of this relationship. Boy and girl's father fight. This is not abnormal. Disagreements occur in many families. But this is abnormal because these two people kill each other. And they kill each other at the start of chapter 2. So actually in this book, the key character in the novel dies within the first 20 pages. The girl, with her now baby, goes to the boy's parents. The parents force the girl to give up her baby, but being generous, nice people, they allow her to stay and act as a nanny, as long as she doesn't reveal her identity. The child grows up to be a man, never knowing his mother. Years later, the girl tells the son she is his mother. This should be an overjoyed, oh mummy moment. He immediately commits suicide jumping off a cliff. Naturally, the girl dies of sadness. Okay, so what haven't I told you? What haven't I mentioned? Because there may be something more to this. Well, the boy is English-American, using the American hyphenated process, and we could categorize him if we needed to racially as being white. The girl is Native American, and if we needed to categorize her, we could possibly say she's red. The son is English Native American, and it's much too complex to come up with a category. So this is the back of the story. This gives us some idea to perhaps what's going on here. Well, this is my wow moment, in that I was surprised, shocked, and confused. What is this all about? It's not at all what I expected from looking at the cover. And considering this was the first of a very populist type of publishing, aimed largely at lower working class, if that terminology works in America at all, population of the 19th century, this is not what I was expecting them to want to read. But I suppose it's not important what I think, more important if we can, to try and find out what the readers of 1860 made of this first dime novel. What might have been their reader response, reception theories. How was it received by these people? What did they read into it themselves? And strangely enough, one can't find out from any external secondary sources because no one has written about this. So we have to look at the internal evidence of the document itself and deduce, being Sherlock. Okay, so I find out, because I'm, remember, still on a voyage of discovery, I found out, in fact, there were 4 different versions of this text. There was the one I was reading, this is this one, which you can get on Amazon.com, nicely reprinted for us. And then there is the 1860 version, the first one that came out. I discovered there were 2 versions of that. The last page in the second version is different from the last page in the first version. And surprisingly, for me anyway, I found out the story had a life before it got to dime novels. And the life was 21 years earlier in a magazine called The Lady's Companion. At that time, the story was just called Malaeska in 1839. So, as I've mentioned before, primary text is the important thing, you have to go back. So, I go back to The Lady's Companion and I find out this is a monthly magazine, and this actually is a short story at this stage in its life, and it's published into 3 parts. Embracing every department of literature, embellished with original engravings and music arranged for the pianoforte, harp and guitar. Little upmarket, may I suggest. Clearly, I could assert, and I'm going to in a moment or two, but prove that the magazine had a largely female readership. There's the inside title page. You can see it's quite ornate. Something very different from the dime novel. This is not intended to appeal to people with hard hands who are digging holes in the road. Contents volume. The contents of the volume, I think, gives us a clue to perhaps our readership. We're looking for evidence, right? So if, for instance, if we look up here, we can see heroines of sacred history. Not heroes, heroines. And we can see Esther, Ruth, Judith, Deborah, Miriam, right? We can see down here, mastery of man. We have natal bowers. We have ministry of childhood, and so on and so on. So I think these stories are largely written by women for women. This is the evidence of the title page. But I think we can go further, because as we've already mentioned up here, these characters, or looked at, are all biblical characters. We can see Jesus of Nazareth mentioned, Jerusalem. We can see Cana of Galilee, and so on. So I think it's reasonable for us to conclude that this type of magazine was aimed at not only women, but they were Christian women and they were white women. Right? This is who this thing was aimed at. Couldn't resist this. It talks about engravings inside. These are one of the engravings. And would you believe this is what the best dressed women from Paris were wearing around this time? It's a shame that Dr. Erin isn't with us, because I knew she would be interested in the feminine fashion. But you can mention it to her when you see her. I did cheat a bit. This is from 1844. However, so the magazine is a women's magazine. Case proven? I think. It's a short story. And with short stories, of course, you have to get your message over quickly. You don't have a lot of time for character development. You don't have a lot of time for meandering. And it is possibly easy to suggest that an author wants to give you a message, so they give you the message plainly and simply. And in this particular book, I'm suggesting the message is plain and is simple. And if we read the last line, Malaeska lay dead among the graves of her household, the heartbroken victim of an unnatural marriage, I think we may see what our author, S, was intending us to take out of the novel. But leave it with me for a moment. No, I wasn't going that way. Let's try that way. By the time it gets to 1860, the novel has doubled its length, but the basic concept hasn't changed. The start and the finish are identical. It's just the middle it's been fleshed out. And by this time we get headings. Either the editor or the author has put them in. And we get headings such as hatred for the Indian race and the half-breed. We get the narrator talking about the grandfather, his blood, all of his being that might descend to prosperity had been mingled with the accursed race who had sacrificed him. Gladly would he rent the two races asunder in the very person of this grandchild, could the pure half of his being been thus preserved. Later on, the son of the white hunter, the man who of course commits suicide on discovering his mother, he says, I was about to be married to one so gentle, so pure. I, an Indian, was about to give my stained hand to a lovely being of untainted blood. I, an Indian, a half-blood. Right? Sort of stuff I don't think we would see written today. I could obviously suggest that's just as well. However, we mustn't apply our 21st century tastes to something that was a 19th century document. But nevertheless, we can try and work out what's going on. So, going back to the narrative that I mentioned,